Hello everyone, my name is Anдрій Боровик. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Tranparency International Ukraine. A few words about TI in Ukraine, what we do. The office was established in 2012, and then since 2014 we are the full members of the global movement. Our projects mostly related to public procurement, sales, to transparency at the municipal level. We have a newly established project related to defense and security, but also we deal with the cases and, for example, promotion of anti-corruptional court. We coordinate with NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau. But today we're going to talk about the corruption in the European Union. For sure, they have less level of corruption than in Ukraine, because they probably started to fight in it many years ago. And to be honest, we doing this work in the last 3 years. So I'm not going to be too talkative, and I pass my word to my colleague, Daniel. And after his lecture, you're welcome to ask any questions. So, please.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation to come here and talk about my work. So my name is Danіель Фройнд. I'm the head of advocacy of Tranparency International in Brussels, and I'm going to speak a bit about the work that we do at the EU level. I'm going to try to draw at least a few parallels on how that impacts here and there on the Ukraine. But if you have any questions at the end, please don't hesitate. Maybe just as a very brief introduction, since I don't know how familiar all of you are with transparency as a global movement. So we have chapters in more than 100 countries around the world at the moment. We pretty much cover the planet, as you can see in this slide behind me. As far as the European Union goes, we are in 25 of the 28 member states of the European Union. And well, the office that I work for, the EU office in Brussels, has been there for about 8 years now. And I'm going to go into what we do in a second. The most well-known product of Tranparency International is probably the Corruption Perception Index, a ranking of the perception of corruption in all countries around the world that we publish once a year. And it was already mentioned that, well, Europe is doing comparatively well when you compare it to other areas of the world, particularly Africa or parts of Asia. And even though many countries in Europe are perceived to be less corrupt, there's a number of reasons why we think it's very important to be active in the European Union as well. So if we look into the main reasons why that is so important for us, other than the amount of money that in Europe is still lost to corruption, which is estimated to be ranging somewhere between 120 billion euros a year and 1 trillion euros a year, which would represent about 7% of GDP, we also think there's a number of other reasons. So the first one is that the European Union has grown increasingly important to the lives of 500 million Europeans. There is more and more legislation going through the EU institutions, more and more competences going to Brussels. So then, of course, for us as an advocacy group, to be present in Brussels is also increasingly important. The second reason is that the amount of money that is controlled in Brussels is very large. The EU budget itself is about 140 billion euros per year, but the amount of money that is governed by EU rules is many times larger than that. So the last numbers that we have from 2014 are 420 billion euros, where the EU basically makes the rules on how this money is spent. So this is procurement, for example, by member states, which over a certain threshold is governed by EU rules. And the final point that I would make is the declining trust into the EU institutions. So both, I would say, at the level of individual citizens. We see that the participation in elections to the European Parliament has been declining for the last 3 decades. When you do surveys of public trust, it goes down. We had a vote by the United Kingdom and a process now, Brexit, to leave the European Union. So the first time a member state leaving, that's obviously a big thing, and given that the EU has been a mechanism to fight corruption, obviously as Transparency International, this is a process that we care about quite a bit. So, what do we do? What does Transparency International EU do in Brussels? The first area of work that we do is on illicit financial flows. So, we have seen before when we looked at the map of the Corruption Perception Index that that is lower in Europe, but often Europe is a safe haven for corruption elsewhere in the world, because our banks, our accounting firms, our luxury products companies facilitate or are involved in stashing money away from elsewhere in the world. People that buy real estate in London or a house on the French coast. All this is happening in the European Union, so we're facilitators of corruption. I would say the second aspect is that there's a lot of money flowing out of the European Union in sort of illicit tax optimization, or companies, not paying their fair share and stashing money away in the British Virgin Islands or in other tax havens. And that is also, or can be also, a form of corruption, and that is definitely something that we want to work on. So at the moment, or let's say over the last few years, the EU has been relatively active in this field. So the first thing where the EU has really been has made a good contribution for good is the whole area of country-by-country reporting. So this means that large multinational companies report for each country that they operate in how much turnover they have, how much profits they make, how many people they employ. So these rules already exist at the moment for the extractive industries, so for oil, gas, mining companies. And for example, you can see for a French oil company like Total, when they're active in Nigeria or in Angola, we can now see how much money are they paying to these governments from the oil extraction that they're doing, and then we can potentially track whether that money actually reaches the populations, whether it ends up in the public budget, or how much of it is potentially lost to corruption on the way. And we're working now to get these kind of rules to apply for all companies and not just banks and extractive industries, because we think that this is something that is very beneficial for all industries. When we have a situation inside the EU at the moment where Amazon, for example, is declaring 25% of its sales anywhere in the world in tiny Luxembourg. So this is clearly a phenomenon where Amazon is using the tax regimes in Europe to, reduce their own tax burden, and that shouldn't happen. They should pay VAT or other sales taxes wherever the sale actually occurs, and not virtually reshift it to Luxembourg, for example. Okay. The second priority we work on is everything where the EU can be a global actor to promote anti-corruption. So this is, for example, through the development aid that the European Union gives. Collectively, the European Union is the largest aid donor in the world. And so obviously, we as Transparency International have an interest that aid money doesn't just end up in the hands of crooks in developing countries. But also the EU, for example, is now considering setting rules on whistleblower protection for the entire European Union. The EU obviously works on the Sustainable Development Goals, and for us, the particularly interesting goal is Goal 16 on good governance. So we hope that the EU very proactively will engage with that process and make sure that its member states commit to ambitious targets under the UN framework for sustainable development. And the third priority, and that's the one that I know best and I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about, is the area of money and politics. So this is an area where we have new forms of corruption. So as we have seen before, again, to come back to the initial map of the Corruption Perception Index, the more well-known forms of corruption, such as bribery, are maybe less prevalent in the European Union, but we have new forms of corruption, where, for example, we have undue influence through lobbying, where we have conflicts of interests, where we have politicians going through the revolving door and getting very lucrative contracts in the private sector after they leave office. And in all these new phenomena that are often less visible, more difficult to detect, but there are risks of corruption, and that is something we look into. To start maybe in this area with a quick case study of how exactly does this look like. Let me give you one example, which is this kind of eco-labeling that the EU does. So we have now, for a lot of products that you buy, be it a vacuum cleaner or a new washing machine, when you go to the store, you find these labels. And this is supposed to give you an idea of how energy efficient, how environmentally friendly the product is. So in 2012, the European Union wanted to introduce a similar labeling for cars. And well, the idea was that if you go to a car dealership and you make up your mind on what car you want to get, you can immediately see which one is more environmentally friendly. So I have here two examples now for cars. On your left, you have a German-made 3.5-ton Porsche Cayenne. And on the right side, you have a 750-kilo Italian-made Fiat 500. And if I can get a quick show of hands from you guys, which one of these two cars intuitively would you say should be more environmentally friendly? Who is for the Fiat 500? Yeah, anyone for the Porsche? Yeah. Some in the back there. Very good. So that is exactly right. So the Porsche gets the much better eco label. And if we make it a bit more extreme still. So now here on the left we have a German tank, a Leopard 2, weighs 62 tons. So any one of you considering maybe to save some fuel and be more environmentally friendly, to maybe take a tank to the supermarket for your shopping? Yeah, we have a few volunteers. So very good. According to the EU labeling, the tank is indeed more friendly to the environment than the small Italian car. So what happened here is basically lobbying, right? Initially, the proposal was very clear. Whatever car emits more CO2 should get the better eco-label. And this is exactly what the institutions in Brussels decided. The parliament and the governments of the member states agreed on this, and you might have thought it's all done and dusted. But when the German car industry, which makes larger and more powerful cars than many of its competitors, when they discovered that they couldn't get their will in Brussels, well, they convinced Angela Merkel to be their chief lobbyist. And she opened up a file that had kind of already been decided. She opened that up again. She threatened a few of the other governments. Ireland, for example, was negotiating its bailout after the financial crisis at the time. And so the Irish were threatened that if they wouldn't support a small change that the Germans had put forward, that they wouldn't get their bailout. So what did they do? Well, they inserted a very small provision that would say that the weight of the car needs to be taken into account. Well, and there you have it, and all of a sudden the tank with the 62-ton is more environmentally friendly. Since then, we have had a huge scandal that broke, referred to as Dieselgate. Basically, American investigations into emissions testing by Volkswagen, but subsequently by other car makers, has showed well, that there is a lot of fraud going on in this business. But we have also discovered that the ties between Volkswagen and other German car makers with politics are incredibly close. They spend a lot of money on lobbying in Brussels. There's a lot of people going in between the car makers and German politics. So the people that are the chief lobbyists of Volkswagen at the global level, but also in Berlin, are the former chief of staff of our former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder and Angela Merkel. Our former transport minister is also a lobbyist for the German car industry now. So you have these incredibly close links between politics and this industry. And, well, as we see, this can lead to a problem where basically government oversight into what they're doing seems to have broken down. So the Americans are suing Volkswagen for a lot of money. Customers that have bought these cars where there was basically false advertising are getting their money back. But none of this is happening in Europe so far. And part of the reason why German customers or other European customers are not getting their cars retrofitted or getting their money back is partly because of political corruption. So when we look into what are we doing about this, we have a number of tools that we're using, and I'm just going to go through these a bit quickly. The first one is integrity system studies, and these are basically qualitative studies looking into how well are the institutions protected from corruption. So the logic behind this is that if the different pillars of society all work well and protect against corruption, well, then a society as a whole is free of corruption. You have higher economic growth, higher wealth, more happiness of the people. So if you have free media, for example, that can report on corruption cases, if you then have a functioning judiciary or investigative institutions that can prosecute corruption, if you have a functioning legislature that can amend the rules if necessary, well, if all this works well, then the fight against corruption works well. We have published a number of reports on different European Union institutions in the last few years where we have analyzed this. If you go on, and as a broad summary, we can say, well, while generally the system works well and the European Union is probably better protected from corruption than many other parts of the world, nevertheless we see that there's quite a few areas where there's still a lot of room for improvement. The first one that I would just briefly mention is legislative transparency. The EU institutions are criticized by a lot of people for not being transparent, that there's a lot of decisions taken behind closed doors, and some of that is true. There is something called trilogues, where the three institutions in Brussels meet behind closed doors, and all of the legislation now goes through basically an opaque process where the normal transparency rules that we have for Parliament do not apply. So that is definitely an issue that we need to address. There's a lot of lobbying in Brussels. There's also problems still with the access to documents regime that we have pointed out in the past that need fixing. The second area is that of ethics and conflicts of interest. And despite the fact that generally we have systems of declarations of financial interest and assets for members of parliament and the commissioners, for example, often this is a bit of a box-ticking exercise and no one actually checks what is really in these declarations. So for members of the European Parliament, for example, we have done a bit of an analysis looking at all these declarations, and many members of Parliament make quite a bit of money on the side from being consultants or freelancers. And well, if they just declare that they're consultants, well, what does that really mean? We have no idea who they work for and whether there is a conflict of interest between what they do on the side and what they vote on in Parliament. So we need a better system for these declarations. The next area is the investigation of corruption. The European Union itself has very little competence to investigate corruption in the member states. It does, however, have competence when it comes to the financial interests of the European Union itself. So wherever the EU gives money through structural funds, through agricultural subsidies, well then there is a body called OLAF, the anti-fraud office, that can investigate if money has disappeared. And as I mentioned, there is quite a bit of money disappearing through these subsidies and funds. But what we also see is that even if Olaf does investigate and compiles a file, well, since they cannot themselves prosecute, well, they are reliant on the prosecution by member states. So let's say there is a highway that has been built in southern Italy with EU money. And we realize, well, half of the money has disappeared and the highway is still not there. So then Olaf investigates, but then has to hand over the dossier to the Italian prosecutors. And we see that over all these procedures, in 50% of the cases, well, the case basically gets lost in that handover. National prosecutors and Olaf mutually blame each other why the system doesn't work. But what we can see from the outside is, well, it doesn't work and it would need fixing. There is an idea that is by now 20 years old to have a European public prosecutor, to basically have a, what the name says, right? A prosecutor at the EU level which could investigate and prosecute cases of corruption. But so far member states are blocking this and they don't want anyone else fiddling in their own affairs. They don't want anyone from Brussels coming in and telling them how corrupt they are. Next slide. I mean, as Transparency International, we don't stop at the analysis, right? We are lobbyists, we're advocates ourselves. So when we do all this analysis work, we also develop recommendations on how things can be improved in the future. In the area of lobbying, to give you just one example, where we have done a regional comparison, we have looked into the regulation of lobbying in 19 EU member states and in the 3 EU institutions, and then we come up with a ranking. But we also then develop, as I said, these policy recommendations on, well, identifying best practice among all these countries and saying, well, you as an EU institution, these are the current rules that you have, but maybe these are some additional ideas on how you can improve transparency of lobbying. And the final tool that I want to mention is EU Integrity Watch. It's a series of online tools, and this goes a bit on, well, the logic behind having these online tools is that having solid laws and robust regulation is only the core of the solution. If you want to make Brussels clean, or any country indeed clean, the first step is to have good rules, but it doesn't stop there. So if we draw the analogy of having a safe street in front of a school, well, the first step is to put up a speed limit, right? But that still doesn't mean that people are going to drive more carefully and more slowly in front of the school. You also need to change the culture. You need people to want to drive carefully. You need people to understand why it's good to drive safe in front of a school, and that might avoid you getting into an accident or injuring a young student or a child. So, and it's exactly the same with political corruption. So we do a lot of education work, telling people on how they can get better at this, how they can be more ethical in their lobbying. And in a way, the EU Integrity Watch then contributes to our role as a watchdog. So we have created all these different tools where we basically allow the public, where we allow journalists, other civil society organizations to fulfill this watchdog function and to keep an eye on for what is going on in Brussels. So we have one tool on the outside activities of members of the European Parliament, where you can immediately see if you want to know who is the member of parliament who makes the most money on the side, who is the one that has most outside activities. You can check that tool and get a ranking. We have then launched 2 tools last year on lobbying. Again, providing information on who are the biggest lobbyists in Brussels, who is spending most money, what are they lobbying on. And the last tool that we launched just in January this year is on revolving doors. So basically we looked into everyone that was in the European Parliament and in the European Commission during the last mandate, and we analyzed where they are now, what new jobs they have gone into and whether there might be a problem with that. So again, you can now filter them, for example, for those that have gone into lobbying in Brussels or are working for registered lobby organizations somewhere in Europe. Some of the things that we learned from all this data analysis and the use of EU Integrity Watch. So on lobbying, for example, we can see that there have been 15,000 lobby meetings at the highest level of the European Commission in the last 2.5 years. And this is an incredible treasure trove of what's going on in Brussels. We can see which are the topics that are most lobbied on. We can break it down by each portfolio in the Commission. We can also see how many lobby organizations there are. Since last summer, the EU lobby register is actually the biggest lobby register in the world. We now have over 11,000 organizations on the register. Thanks to that information, we can estimate that there's at least 35,000 lobbyists active in Brussels. So there's more lobbyists than there is staff in the European Commission in Brussels. And we can estimate that the lobbyists spend about 1.5 billion euros a year on influencing decisions by the EU institutions. On the revolving door, as I mentioned, so what we see there is that for the members of the European Parliament, which have since left politics, 30% are now working for registered lobby organizations. For the European Commission, the share is over 50%. And you might have heard that our former Commission President, Barroso, went on to become a board member of Goldman Sachs last summer, and that stirred quite a bit of debate in Brussels. What we see is that, for example, members of the European Parliament at the moment, there are no rules for when they leave office. There's no cooling off periods, there is no rules whatsoever, so the day that they leave the Parliament, they can basically start working in lobbying, and 26 cases we have identified where members of Parliament have basically gone straight into Brussels lobby consultancies, so they now lobby on behalf of clients. They go back into the European Parliament to seek to influence their former colleagues or staff. And this is particularly disturbing since their staff is actually not allowed to do that. So for the assistants of members of Parliament, you have a 2-year cooling off period, but their bosses are free to go the next day, do whatever they want. We've also looked into the case of Google. So at the moment, Google is the most influential company in Brussels. No other company has anywhere close to the same access to the high-level decision makers. They have more meetings than anybody else, and by a distance. And one of the reasons that we identify is that they really are quite aggressive in hiring people from the institutions. So we have found a lot of cases in the US, in the European Union, but very concretely, if I look at the people that have a lobby badge for the European Parliament, this is public information, well, more than 50% of the Google lobbyists have been hired directly from the Parliament to lobby their colleagues. And Jean-Claude Juncker, the current Commission President, well, he wants the EU to be a global leader in ethics and transparency. He has repeatedly said that. He campaigned on that during the last European elections. But I think, as I've shown tonight, there's still a number of things where the EU can get a lot better still. And to draw a bit now to conclusion, but draw also some parallels to what's going on with the Ukraine. So the first thing where the European Commission really is abandoning one of its flagships activities in the area of anti-corruption is the anti-corruption report. So in 2014, the Commission published a report on what is the situation in the fight against corruption in every single member state. And in the beginning of this year now, the Commission has said that it is abandoning the anti-corruption report, so there won't be any further editions of that. I think the European Union in general has been strongest in its anti-corruption work when it comes to pre-accession and accession countries, particularly the new member states in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, all the other ones. These countries made incredible progress in the fight against corruption when they were trying to become members of the European Union. And there really has been a lot of progress during that time. But the moment that they joined, the pressure was off. And since then, we have basically seen that many of these countries stagnate or actually are now regressing. So in Hungary, for example, we have a situation where Orban and his family and friends are basically looting the central bank. They're stealing EU and national funds. They're preventing investigations by Olaf and others. And anyone that criticizes this situation, be it the opposition, be it the media, be it civil society, well, they get a lot of pressure from the government. The media is more and more controlled by the government or by Orban's friends. Civil society now is discredited as foreign agents that are controlled by Soros or are financed from abroad. So we basically have a lot of regress, and that is generally something that we see, unfortunately, and more member states. So the EU really needs to look into what it can do even when a country has already joined. The second thing, I mean, I already mentioned the case of Hungary, but I think the EU can be stronger still in also protecting civil society in countries around the world, be that here in Ukraine, but everywhere, to basically stand up and protect that civil society, that media can do its work to fight corruption in countries around the world. Yeah, and I mentioned accession or pre-accession countries. I think Ukraine is an example for that as well, that using the visa access to the European Union seems to have been a good tool to still get a few reforms out of the Ukrainian government, but this is definitely something where we can't take away the pressure, because we see that as soon as that happens, governments are a bit too eager to immediately abandon the fight against corruption. So I'm going to leave it here. Feel free, any comments, any questions that you might have and that I can answer, I'll try my best.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Katerina. I'm working for the Euro integration of Ukraine. So this topic is quite interesting for me, and I would like to ask about the tool which you told, exactly about watchdogs and, I mean, online tool. Yeah. And I have a question. How do you think may other competition bodies use this tool for manipulating of their competitors? How do you think may it be used in the wrong way? Because as I understood, a lot of people have access to this tool and may say maybe wrong facts, maybe how do you check those facts? Are they real? how many barbers and etc. So, because I think it's quite interesting idea, and for Ukraine I think it would be really useful, but a lot of people may think how to use it wrong, you know. So I have this question. Thank you.
So first of all, where does the data come from? Because this is not something, this is not based on our own research or our own investigations, but this is data that comes either from the institutions, so the meetings are declared by the European Commission. So this is, and we have seen in the past that this is very reliable, because a lot of people have looked at that, and if someone doesn't publish a meeting, for example, then relatively quickly you have a story in the media about this. And the second data set comes from the lobby register. So this is information that the lobbyists themselves provide. Partly why we have put this information out there is because the quality of that data is often not reliable. So with our tool now, since you can easily rank and filter all this information, we are actually hoping that will clean up the data, that people see, oh, the biggest lobbyist is some obscure NGO from Finland that no one has ever heard of. That must be a mistake. And then you can submit an official complaint to the lobby register and say, this is probably a mistake. Can you check with the organization whether this is correct? Whether anyone is using this wrongly, I haven't heard about this so far. I know that quite a bit of the users of our website are lobbyists themselves. They check up on what's the competition doing, who else is speaking about this topic. But I think that is probably a good thing, right? Our idea of lobbying is, as long as things are transparent, and as long as there is a certain balance between all the actors, this is all good. We need lobbying. A representative democracy can't work without lobbying. And hopefully the tool allows politicians to, talk to everyone that is active on a certain question, get all the arguments, and then at the end of the day, make a good informed decision on what's best for society and all of us. So we hope that the tool contributes to that.
Good evening. My name is Miroslava Vorontsova. I'm a legal advisor for the USAID New Justice Program. Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. I actually have two quick questions. First one, the reporting corruption and whistleblower mechanism, is it that popular among citizens, and to what extent it's being used? Do you have any data about it? Because for Ukraine, it's really a big problem. We have a strikingly high level of tolerance to the corruption among citizens. So I wonder whether the whistleblower mechanism ever will work here. And secondly, you've mentioned that even after being investigating, cases are dying without being adjudicative. As the representative of the judicial reform efforts, I wonder how you fighting this issue. Thank you.
These are very good and very hard questions to answer. I think ultimately, the first thing to say is that the moment that no one cares, we're losing the fight against corruption, right? If cases of corruptions emerge and no one cares and no one is in the street, we're losing. And I think the comparison is quite striking if I look at two of the EU member states. So if I look at Romania, where recently we had hundreds of thousands of people in the street when the government tried to change the rules for corruption, basically bringing up the threshold so that many of the people that are currently being investigated or have been put in jail actually for offenses would then no longer fall under the rules. And well, if you have such strong showing and the people are in the street, well, the politicians for now backed off. I think they're still trying to fiddle with it, but public attention needs to be kept onto this. They need to remain vigilant, and whenever someone tries to mess with the system, they have to be out there and say, no, we won't tolerate that. If I compare that with the situation in Hungary, it is quite different, where unfortunately we have not seen a similar mobilization. And I guess the big trick that Orban manages to play is that each one of the changes that he introduces is small enough not to trigger a mass mobilization. And that is incredibly dangerous. And what do you do? What do our colleagues do in Hungary to fight this? Well, we try to get people outraged and to get people in the street, but it is a difficult job that we try every day.
Hello, my name is Eli. I'm a master student, law student. I have a question. You mentioned that new indirect corruption in EU institutions when ex-staff of EU institutions, when later, after their retirement, they starting to work in some lobbyist companies or just companies. And where is the line between when it's the corruption, when the person, when there was an arrangement between or agreement between lobbyists and staff of EU institutions, and when a person just decided to start a new life in some different sphere. So do you have any plans for a mechanism in this sphere, how to check? And as I understand, the most important is to find the connection or the arrangements before the moment of leaving the EU institution.
I mean, the moment that you have corruption is when there is a quid pro quo, right? If a member of parliament, for example, is approached by a lobbyist who tells him, you vote on this file this way that I tell you, and then when you leave office, I have a good job for you in my company. Then we have a clear quid pro quo, and that is corruption. But this is obviously very difficult to detect, and unless you're in the room during that conversation, it's probably difficult to prove. Nevertheless, at least having, when something like this does come out, then at least you want to have the rules in place to prosecute. So what are we suggesting very concretely? Because you're absolutely right. I mean, the right to work and to choose your profession freely is a strong fundamental right, and we don't want to block any move between politics and any other kind of job. I think we need the transfer of knowledge. I think it's good when people have seen a bit, politicians that have been in the private sector, or when people with experience from inside the EU institutions go and do something else and can bring their knowledge of the EU institutions into other organizations. I think that can be very beneficial. But what we want to make sure is that in that change, in that transition, we need to avoid that there is ethics issues and conflicts of interest that arise. So I would say two things that we would like to see. The first thing is cooling off periods. So for members of the European Parliament, for example, they receive a transitional allowance when they leave office. So they're still paid by the taxpayer for, depending on how long they have been in the Parliament, but between 6 months and 2 years, they still receive their full salary from the taxpayer to reintegrate into the job market, right? And we say, well, while you're still on the taxpayer money, you should not be lobbying. You should not be able to go back and lobby your former colleagues. You can do all kinds of other things, but don't come back as a lobbyist. And the second thing that we would like to see is that there is an independent oversight body. Because as you say, it's very difficult to come up with very general rules, and this is probably an issue where you have to rule on a case-by-case basis, where an independent body has to analyze, well, in this change of job, is there a conflict of interest? Is this something that we can allow? So we want to see an independent body taking this decision, because at the moment, so for European commissioners, there already is a cooling off period of up to 18 months. So what happens is whenever a commissioner after leaving office wants a new job, he notifies the commission and says, I want to do this, I want to go work for Goldman Sachs. And then the commission looks into this and says, yes, you can go do that, this is not something where there's an issue, or they say, no, you can't do this, or they can impose certain conditions, such as you can go do the job, but you can't come back and lobby us. But the problem is that all these decisions are taken by the current commission. So you basically have former colleagues or your predecessor asking you if they can take a certain job, and you might already have at the back of your head that a couple of years down the line you're in the same situation. So I'm not going to be too hard on this one, because I as well, when I leave, want to have a good job, and that's not great. We want to have an independent body that decides in these occasions.
Hi, thank you for this talk. My name is Pavlo. I am a co-author of the complianceperiscope.com, which is a blog devoted to anti-corruption compliance in Ukraine. I'm also head of legal and compliance function for Ukraine, some CIS countries, and Romania. So I have kind of one comment and two questions, if I may. So one comment on the perception of corruption is that if there is an economic growth, then people, usually low-level income or middle-level income, they would not wonder what is wrong in the system, if it is corrupt or not. So I'm talking about that you say constantly that Europe has a much better situation in terms of corruption as opposed to Ukraine. So I'm joking that would be trying to turn the situation around, because for us we have an economic downturn. We try to see whom to blame, and we kind of understand that we should blame corruption. And Europe has been very well in terms of economic growth. Lucky you and all the European Union. And I think many people, if they ask what is their corruption perception, they would say, oh, it's not that bad. It's all fine. So I got the minimum services fine. I don't have this bureaucracy. I have this and that. It's all fine, but the top level of corruption and the lobbyism that you discuss, I think there might be some issues. And this is, of course, because it's very difficult to calculate corruption. And in my view, perception is one way to look at it, but it's definitely not what the actual corruption is. Yeah. And I have two questions, actually. You said that in European Union there is no that whistleblowers protection as we have in probably in United States. Not sure if that's correct, if you can comment, but also there is no, and this is like a question which will relate, a private prosecution, a topic of private prosecution. In United States and Canada there is a private prosecution. And European Union, my question is if there is a private prosecution, or if there is a lobby on private prosecution. So I will tell how it will help. For example, let's say tomorrow to a company, one public servant comes and says, I want a bribe, like for law enforcement authorities. So the company has a few options, either to close down the business, or to give a bribe, or to hire attorneys and try to find and hope, and maybe it will work out, maybe not. So the third option would be to, the detective, the licensed detective would be the same as investigators, and the attorneys would be as prosecutors. So attorney is, so the prosecutor is attorney of a state, but the attorneys, so the private prosecution, who would be able to collect the evidence. So the company would hire the detective and an attorney. They would collect the evidence that somebody asked them for bribe, and then they would be happily providing that in the court of law, standing in front of the court and proving that that public official from law enforcement authority is corrupt. Currently we have a bottleneck for law enforcement authorities because of the old system that we had from Soviet system. They kind of protect each other. If you file a complaint against one public authority to consider by another public authority, they will take care of each other. They will pay each other, but they will never prosecute. So this is like the system which is there. And maybe in any case where there is a monopoly by the state, so let's say in management of assets, privatization appeared because government was not successfully managing assets. Then courts, arbitration appeared. Then law enforcement, not law enforcement, but the executors of court decisions, the private execution services appeared because the state execution service could not cope well. So now the weak link and the monopoly is on the investigation. At least in Ukraine, that is the case. As soon as the professional line of detectives and prosecutors and attorneys appear, then companies would fund the attorneys and detectives. There will be work for them, and they would be helping them to fight corruption in an ethical way. And there will be no monopoly. And those people who are investigators, they would be competing with detectives and will be growing in their competence, and we can be caught. So my question on private prosecution, and second, very quick on personal data protection. There is an enhancement in the legislation. Do you see a threat from the standpoint of personal data protection? Because if now in this other room somebody is giving bribe to somebody else, and I take my phone and make a picture or make a video, so people, that would be not a valid evidence in the court, because there is a constitution court decision in Ukraine, at least, which does not allow to take this not procedurally rightly collected evidence to prove the guilt of that person. But the more we protect privacy, there is less for transparency. So personal data protection, we should be open for some personal data. We should be opening some up so that people can freely trace, at least for public servants, so that anyone can say, and the risk would be so high so that they will not do, or the risk and the burden would be too much. Two questions on the private prosecution and I'm so sorry I took a lot of time. Thank you.
A lot of stuff to comment on. I think on the private prosecution, I'll just have to say it's not something that I've worked on or come across in detail, so I wouldn't really know how to comment. Partly, I mean, you mentioned whistleblowers, and I realized that was a part of your question that I didn't answer before. So at the moment, the situation is that whistleblower protection is a national competence. So a number of member states do protect whistleblowers, but there is no harmonized protection across the EU. And what the European Parliament has been pushing for now is that there is a common minimum protection that would apply across the EU. Inside the EU institutions, there is rules for whistleblowers. So since 2014, we have rules in all EU institutions, and there should be channels available internally to all staff if they come across anything. And actually, all staff of the EU is legally obliged to blow the whistle. So if you are a small case handler and you realize that in a project you oversee there's something not going well, or you see your boss doing something that you find strange, you have a legal obligation to speak up and to report it. So hopefully that will in the future help to bring about more protection against corruption, since whistleblowers are a primary source of uncovering cases of corruption. What you mentioned about the intersection of privacy and the fight against corruption, I mean, sometimes it's portrayed as a sort of, you can either have privacy or fight corruption, and I'm not sure you really have that. I think, I mean, as with many fundamental rights, you have to find a right weighting of one against the other. I think we should all have strong right to privacy, but we should not have the right to be protected from prosecution in cases of corruption. So I'd say yes, privacy applies, and you shouldn't be allowed to just film anyone and put that online. But if you film someone that is committing a crime and this can be used as evidence, well, then I think you have just waived your right to privacy, right? And then that should be able to be used. And I think sensible lawmakers and sensible prosecutors and judges should recognize that.
I would just like to add, to answer partially to your question, that do they have in the EU the private prosecution? At least for today, the United Kingdom is a part of the EU, so they do have this, they call them barristers, so they can act from the both sides, so we can read more about this. And a brief comment about the perception of corruption and economic growth. But what I personally believe that corruption, yes, that can occur, that probably was in Ukraine like in 2006 or 2007 before the huge financial crisis, that no one cared about the corruption and there was a huge, like for us, economic growth. But I always answer what can be if there was no corruption at those days. Maybe we could reach those GDP growths like it was in China, like 15% growth, not 7. So I would never correlate so like directly between the, for example, even CPI and economic growth.
And just to say, I mean, what I said about the CPI is just one of our tools. So the analysis of how corrupt a country or an institution is, well, CPI is a sort of a very quantitative measure. But as I said, all the reports that we do, the integrity system analysis, those are then the more qualitative tools that we use for our analysis. And I think, I mean, what I at least try to say with my presentation is that, well, in some countries, and I would partly count the Ukraine under these, you have more obvious forms of corruption still, of bribery, sort of petty corruption, quite widespread, that you have less of in the EU. But then you have people stealing in the hundreds of millions through tax evasion or sheltering corrupt money from elsewhere. And I wouldn't necessarily make a judgment call on which one of those is worse.
Good evening. My name is Dmitry Kuzin. I'm a lawyer in NGO Civil Illustration Committee, but excuse me, I will speak in Ukrainian. В Україні є закон про запобігання корупції, і там є норма, згідно з якою рішення, які прийняті в умовах конфлікту інтересів, вони можуть бути визнані недійсними. Чи є такі норми в країнах, які ви досліджували, і чи працюють ці норми, чи є випадки, коли такі рішення були дійсно визнані недійсними, тому що в нас поки така норма не працює, на жаль. Дякую.
Well, the situation that I know best is that in the EU institutions, and I'm not aware of a case where a decision has been sent back or challenged because of, well, it emerged afterwards that there had been conflicts of interest. And I think, I mean, as I alluded to, I think, I mean, we do have rules on this, but in practice, often these rules are still not perfect, and it is still an area where we continue to work on. And I think at some point we have to reflect on whether members of parliament, that is a full-time job, they are very well paid in the European Parliament, whether these people should have other activities on the side where they often make more money still than they do as member of parliament, and then publishing declarations that are meaningless and don't inform on potential conflicts of interest. I think that is a situation that needs rectifying in the EU as well.
My question is about lobbying in general. So, as you know, we don't have any legal regulation for lobbying in Ukraine, so there is no institution of lobbying. And there were some trying to impose this, but the point of view of young reformers and really good member of parliaments that we don't need it because we don't have previous experience, and if we will impose it, that will be just an opportunity to for corruptioners to some instrument to make some part of corruption legal. So what do you think? Do Ukraine needs a legal regulation for lobbying?
It's an interesting question. I don't know the situation here in the Ukraine very well. I'm the first time here in the Ukraine. I arrived early this afternoon. From what I've seen so far and what I know about lobbying and the situation here, generally speaking, TI, we recommend that lobby registers are good tools to make lobbying more transparent. As I said, lobbying is a part of any healthy democracy. Lots of what we do aims at sort of demystifying a bit what lobbying actually is. I know that in many countries, lobbying sometimes is synonym of corruption and all lobbying is bad. And then I often say, well, Tranparency International, Greenpeace, Amnesty International, we're all lobbyists. And I'm not making a judgment call. As long as someone represents a legal activity, it's legitimate. They should be allowed to defend what they do and voice whatever their interest is. I think in that sense, at some point, it would probably be good for the Ukraine to adopt a lobbying law. Is a lobbying law the absolute most urgent thing for the Ukraine to have now? And is it the best tool in the situation that you're currently in? I'll leave that to TI Ukraine, but it's usually not the first thing you do. When you have a lot of problems with corruptions, lobbying is not the very first thing to fix. And the second thing I would like to point to, and I've heard some of that in the Ukraine here already now today, is that lobby laws can be misused. And I alluded to in my presentation that the crackdown on civil society and reducing the space for civil society is an issue in many countries around the world, and there is some indications of that here in the Ukraine as well. So if then the lobby law is misused to intimidate or make the work of civil society in the Ukraine more difficult, well then that is definitely not the right step forward.
I can just say that I agree with Daniel that lobby registers and lobbying legislation is quite important and should be implemented in any country. But as you probably know, there is the last steps of the government, of the parliament. They showed that they can use any tool which was actually funded or implemented by the NGOs to control those who are in power, for example, electronic declarations. They can reverse it and use it as a weapon against the NGOs. So in this case, it is important that those, for example, civil society representatives who work on different issues were not called the lobbyists, and there was no limitations against them. Тоді дякую всім, що прийшли. Сподіваюсь, вам сподобалась лекція Даніела. І, звісно, ми хочемо сказати дякую фонду Наумана, якого, на жаль, сьогодні з нами немає через технічні причини. Завдяки фонду Фрідріха Наумана Даніел зміг відвідати Україну і поспілкуватися з нами сьогодні. Дякую всім, гарної п'ятниці.
Sorry for interruption. No, it's just, I'm surprised that we haven't met before, because my duty in the project is actually conflict of interest and corruption combating in the judiciary. So now we would involve the NABU and CP cooperation, but we do work with the judiciary.
My personal card maybe not that much required. It's in a more commercial area.
Ну, з TI зустрічалася, але дуже опосередковано, десь так паралельно перекиналися на заходах, там Чеснока і Запорожжя.
Okay, we'll talk to you.
Так, дивіться, питання в тому, що ми ось just a quick note that on Friday, next Friday I'm hosting the roundtable on the conflict of interest in the justice sector in Ukraine. And actually we invited another, your colleague from German, Tilman Hoppe, Dr. Tilman Hoppe, who will come with the intermediate report on the corruption, on the conflict of interest matters in our justice sector. So for us it's actually, I just what do you think question? You said that NGOs and civil society organizations are usually the watchdogs, the most active watchdogs.
Well,
and or advocates like.
And I mean, to some degree, you have institutional watchdogs as well. Like Parliament is supposed to be a watchdog.